Welcome back to Mindful Masculinity, a podcast about how men can explore the parts of themselves that they feel make life more fulfilling and give them a healthier approach to living. Today, I'm with Chris Brown. Chris is a Substacker. He'll tell a little bit about himself in a minute. But why Chris and I are talking today is because the movie The Invite has truly been a provocative approach to human relationships. Now, I won't do any spoilers here on the podcast, but I really walked away seeing two different men in the movie with a different approach to masculinity. Seth Rogen plays Joe, Ed Norton plays Hawk. And as you watch the movie unfold, what you see are two men struggling with some of the very same issues, but with different approaches. And I think what Rashida Jones and Will Cormack are doing with the screenplay and what Olivia Wilde was doing with her direction is really informative for men and can help them think about what's going on inside me emotionally and deeper down. How does that present itself externally to the people in my life, the people I love? And how can I go on this journey of living a better life? So, Chris Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a clinical social worker. I've been in practice over 25 years, specialize in relationships. I was Gottman trained. So I know all of the research-backed techniques and tools to help people build rockstar relationships. I also know what causes relationships to fail according to the research. What I found over a decade or more of doing that work is that what the Gottmans left out was sex. And so along the way, the assumption was that if there was a sex problem in the relationship, there was a relationship problem. And if you fix the relationship, then good sex would follow. And what I found in my practice is that was true about 4 out of 10 times. And there were times where that really made a lot of sense. But then there were people who would come into my practice and they didn't like each other very much and they never had sex. And what I found is they would leave my practice very good friends who never had sex. And so I thought, well, what am I missing? And so along the way, to help some specific people in my practice, I became a certified sex therapist. And there is a whole lot that traditional psychotherapy training and application in the US leave out of the room. And so my practice, which is Sapient, is the psychotherapy practice that talks openly and broadly about sex through the lifespan.
I think Chris is an extremely appropriate person for this discussion because, again, without going too deep into the movie, but you can tell this from the trailers and from any coverage that you've seen and movie reviews, is that is one of the core aspects of the movie The Invite. You have this couple, Joe and Angela, who you can see from the very beginning are struggling with a bunch of emotions and with their relationship. And through the invitation from Angela is this couple. And Pina and Hawk at Norton have a much more open approach to sex. And I won't betray any confidences, but the contrast between the two couples is what provokes so much of the tension in the movie, so much of the action in the movie, and certainly eventually leads to some kind of resolution of the principal protagonists, Joe and Angela. So, Chris, at a very high level, what did you take away from the movie, given your background and expertise in relationships and human sexuality?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a cheat code going into the movie. I saw it a couple of weeks ago, and I know my psychotherapy hero and a woman that I have trained with in her online training salons and many in-person practices is Esther Perel. And Esther was a consultant on this film. And there are several lines in the movie that are lifted exactly from Esther's work. In fact, my wife and I, who saw it together, we're such sex nerds in this space that we could finish a couple of lines in the movie because we know exactly who they came from, and we know exactly what they are. And so the piece that I saw really that made me think is it was a movie ostensibly about polyamory and ethical non-monogamy, but what it really is about relationships and the behaviors that drive relationships to the end. And then what do these people do? So sex was kind of the entree into the story, I think, at least it was for me. And then what I really saw on screen was a clinic in the behaviors that build relationships and the behaviors that tear them down.
Now, one of the things that really helps the movie present what Chris just said is the fact that Pina, the female protagonist from the other couple, is a sexologist, psychotherapist. So she has the background to study Joe and Angela and provoke a conversation that really pushes the two of them to uncover, whether directly or indirectly, whether they're triggered or they choose to open up, to talk about the things that are going on inside themselves that they haven't told the other person, but the other person experiences it. Chris, again, without giving away too much about the movie, what did you see in terms of how typical, heterosexual men in a relationship, how the relationship between Joe and Angela reflected a lot of the kind of open dialogue about the emotions and the sex that goes on in an intimate relationship?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things stand out, Richard. One is what is social construct? What are the expectations that men and women have? And we're going to assume heteronormativity here. So when we're talking about men and women in relationship and or marriage, and I will use those often interchangeably, and they're not always the same, but I will use those interchangeably, is what are the social constructs and the expectations that we unconsciously and implicitly bring into a marriage or a relationship. And we never, particularly in the straight world, we never negotiate them up front. We never talk about them. But what we do is we live with them in our expectation with the assumption that they're mutual on both sides. And then it's not until sometimes, and is portrayed in the movie, over a decade later, do these mismatches in expectations, what was assumed about sex, what was assumed about relationships, what was assumed about the labor of the family and the household, what the assumptions were, and they don't really get discussed until there's a crisis. And then in my experience, not talking about the movie, but talking about my practice, at that point, when it's discussed in a crisis, finally, it's often, not always, but often too late.
I'm really fascinated, Chris, about how men intellectually approach sex, because I have a theory, and I'd love to hear you either debunk it or analyze it. I have a theory that men are not as embodied in their physical form as females are. I'm not sure why, but I think the result of this lesser ability to feel embodied makes it more difficult for a man to understand what is it I'm trying to get out of a sexual relationship with a woman. Have you experienced that? Have you seen that? Am I wrong in my assumptions?
No, you're not wrong at all. There are a couple of things. One, so I work on a micro level, is what we call it in social work. So to take the jargon out of it, I work one-on-one, or if I'm working with a couple or a polyam network, I may have a group of people in my office at any given time, but we're talking about their individual situation, their individual relationship. So the where it gets tricky is what you're doing is you're making a generalization saying, hey, men are generally less embodied than women. And that is true. That is true. And we can talk a lot about the macro. And when you get into the micro, and I think Angela is a good example of this in the movie, while generally women may be more embodied than men, and that is true, Angela herself, at least in my viewing of her, was a woman who was not embodied. And so you really do, on an individual level, find that sometimes these generalizations apply and sometimes they don't. And I think the Hawk character kind of showed us an atypical male who was a bit more embodied. And there's a wonderful monologue that Edward Norton gives. And I know from listening about the movie that he did that without tipping his hand in the script to the other cast members. So as you see this movie, and I would highly recommend it, by the way, it plays out like a theater production play more than a movie. And so that particular speech, and I won't spoil it, but he talks about how he became self-aware and self-embodied of his sexual self. And I think for a lot of men, there has to be a loss to trigger us to do the internal work to become embodied. For the audience listening, Richard and I were sharing our marathoning history. And Richard, one of the reasons I took up marathoning at 50 is I wanted to have an embodied experience. That I realized I was a single case example of the trend you described, that I had been a man going through the world for 4 decades, and I had no real sense of my own body. And so I started marathoning in part to have an embodied experience so I can really feel my body. And as you know, you get to mile 20 and you're going to feel your body.
Yes. It's interesting. I never thought about that, Chris. But in my personal marriage relationship, I got divorced in 2017. The divorce started in 2013. And the separation, especially the physical and emotional separation, started way before that. And now, listening to you, I would have to say that the spiritual side of me probably started emerging at about the same time I started training for marathons, because now, putting 2 and 2 together, like you said, when you go out on a 22 mile solo training run,
That's right.
you know everything about your body.
That's right.
Because you're feeling it so viscerally. And a bit of a confession here for anybody who knows me, I was probably more of a spectator during sex prior to my marathoning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was because the way I had been raised to understand what a man does in a sexual encounter with a female was much more performative. It was, this is what I'm supposed to do. And now I'm going to pay attention to how she reacts. And I don't know that I was particularly embodied at that time to say, yeah, but what about me? I mean, and I know that probably sounds ridiculous to a lot of females. Well, it's all about you. It's all about penetrative sex. It's all about, you finally, getting to orgasm. That wasn't my experience.
Yeah, that's the myth or the archetype. And Richard, what you're describing, and I would put my sexual experiences up until I started marathoning, really, with the intent of learning how to feel in my own body. You and I were exceptions to that general rule. And so that's why I always say to folks, when you hear generalizations, you may be an exception to that generalization, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Because a lot of times we think as men, we're supposed to perform a certain way. And then we're also told, it is all about us because, the orgasm gap in heterosexual couples, for example. And yet I've talked to more and more men who have such a fraught relationship with their own orgasm and their own sex, because really a couple of things. And this is, again, for the audience, this is me zooming out and going broad. So you may be an exception to this rule, individual listener, but generally speaking, men are supposed to be rock hard and ready to go at all times. And if they're not, they're doing it wrong somehow. And usually men at a high level, we're not taught to receive nurturing, affection, physical touch outside of sex. So generally speaking, men funnel all of those needs into the sexual experience. And if you start thinking about it, that in and of itself funnels a lot of pressure into a sexual experience. Then, and Richard, you're implying this, and I'll own it for myself, my self-esteem up until I started marathoning in my 50s, and I made my sexual debut around 18 or 19. So you think about that, I had 30 years of sex where the implied contract with me and a partner was, you have to come and you have to come a lot because I have to be good at this because that's how I'm going to get my self-esteem needs met. Right. And so now not only am I loading all of my needs for physical affection and touch into a partnered sex experience, but I'm loading my self-esteem into it. And if she doesn't perform great, if I don't perform great and she doesn't respond with this amazing, spectacular orgasm, then I fell into believing that I wasn't any good. Well, all of a sudden, you load a sexual experience up with that much pressure. And oh my gosh, okay, so now, do I want to engage in a sexual experience with all that pressure, or would I rather binge watch a show on Netflix? It's a lot less risk. And so now we talk a lot about the sex gap and this, the sex, desert that a lot of the younger generation is in. Well, this is part of it. There's so much loaded on these sexual experiences that they become too high stakes. They become too high stakes. And so often people just avoid it altogether, right? Or they'll drink or drug it away, all this feeling and insecurity. So then I can show up and, Richard, as you said, perform. And once it's performative sex, it's no longer embodied. And pleasure often leaves. It's so paradoxical. The more we want pleasure, the more we chase it, the harder it is to find in a lot of circumstances. And I think The Invite does an incredible job of painting that picture, especially between Angela and Joe.
So let's talk about that. There's a scene where Joe is with the very sexy Penelope Cruz. They're alone in his office where his piano is and all of his books. And she asks him to do a dance for her. How would you describe the character Joe, and certainly how Seth Rogen portrayed that character, as indicative of men being embodied in a sexual situation?
I think it's a great scene, and it's a poignant scene, and one that made me feel quite a lot. I felt a lot of empathy for Joe in that moment, and he's being asked to perform, but not perform sexually, but perform a dance. And I think Seth does such an amazing job of being so rigid and uncomfortable and awkward. And yet when he's in that moment with Penelope Cruz's character, you also get this underlying, and he just portrays it so well, where he's just telling her, thank you. Thank you. And he's so grateful to be receiving any attention. And certainly, she's a beautiful person and he gets to see her and he's so grateful. And yet when it comes to him moving in a non-sexual sense, a standing dance, it's almost like he doesn't know how to do it. And what comes out once he does start getting embodied, I won't spoil it for the audience if you haven't seen it, it ends up being one of the funniest but then most poignant scenes in the movie, where oftentimes men, when they get into their bodies, what they don't know how to feel pleasure, but what they do know how to feel is pain. What they do know how to feel is pain.
Yeah. And again, not to spoil anything, but pain arises.
It plays a part. It plays a part. And I do think that is a typical disembodied position. And Richard, to your point earlier, men are generally disembodied, and we're not, we as men are not given any encouragement to, say, develop a yoga practice or any sort of embodied practice. Maybe outside of martial arts, maybe there's a little bit, but usually it's for fighting. It's not for flow, like, say, Tai Chi, right? So again, men are not culturally encouraged to those practices. And so where is the place where we get to feel our bodies and the body of another person? In partnered sex. So again, it layers so much pressure onto that activity that oftentimes it becomes easier to avoid it than to have it.
Now, I am being so careful not to spoil this movie for anybody who's been watching this who hasn't seen it yet, but I'll allude to it because it's the preface to my question, Chris. Joe finds out something about what Angela has been doing
Mm-hmm.
to express herself sexually,
Mm-hmm.
and it freaks him out.
Yeah.
Let's use your experience in your profession. Um, Help me understand what you think Angela was going through and why she made the choices that she did. And of course, this is not related to, that night, but what had been happening up until that night. What she was doing, how can men think about that and think about whether or not they want to respond the way Joe does, or what the alternatives are in order to understand their female partner and maybe support her and maybe even reconnect with her?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. It's a great question. So my experience of the Angela character was to be, in a lot of ways, stereotypic masculine experience, which is she is, and pardon the clinical language, I'll say cut off from, not clinical, but dissociated from, which is the clinical language, her own eroticism. Right. And so eroticism is a sense of aliveness in ourselves. And then if we have it in ourselves, it's a lens through which we can see the world. Right. So we can cultivate an erotic life, both internally and externally. And I think what you're describing with Angela is she has an accidental series of encounters that spark something in her that she had lost. And my viewing of it was her sense of eroticism. And so then she found it in this accidental encounter that then developed into something else, right? But it became a way that she could feel her erotic self in a relatively safe way. And so when it comes out in the movie as a surprise and an unfortunate surprise to her partner, what I saw was, and I saw this in the Pina and Joe scene where, you'd asked about the dance. I saw this terribly insecure man trying to grapple with his own feelings and his own brakes, if you will, to try to find the accelerator to get going. Right. So you have this very insecure man finding out that his wife has been having these series of erotic experiences that he, one, had no participation in, and two, no awareness of. And so in that moment, it's one of the hardest moments. So what's happening to Joe in that moment when he has this surprise discovery is he's getting flooded. He's getting flooded with emotional intensity that I feel certain he doesn't have language to narrate or articulate. And so he's acting out. He's acting out in that scene. And so, Richard, to your point, is what do we do when we become surprised by something that really hits us at a core insecure level? This is one of the hardest miles of the relational marathon, because I've got to have my feelings, recognize them, have some awareness of them, breathe and ground and hold my own emotion while I stay curious about what is happening to my partner in this exchange when it is wildly scary to me while I'm discovering it. And that is really difficult. And so in clinical speak, what that is Joe would have been better served with a strong sense of differentiation, which is I can stay in my body, aware of myself, and still curious about what's happening with my partner while I'm hearing something that's difficult to hear. And Joe didn't have the capacity. It would be like going out on a long run and trying to do 20 miles, like from the couch to 20 miles. He just couldn't do it. And that's no criticism of him. He had no practice of differentiation to be able to know his feelings, hold them, then be curious and get more information, right? Because that would have been the ideal way to handle it. But poor Joe, again, that's asking him in that moment to go do a long run when he hadn't been doing anything but eating chips and watching, TV or his phone, so he just wasn't equipped for that moment.
I love your running metaphor because, number one, it ties into how my running eventually led to my mindfulness practice, my meditation
Absolutely.
practice, because when you're out on a 12-mile, you're out on a 20-mile run and you're at 12 miles and you have 8 more miles to go.
Sure.
You really have to get inside your head to figure out how you're going to move past the fatigue, whether or not you're feeling pain in a muscle, you're feeling depletion of your glucose. And now you're saying to yourself, I'm running 9-minute miles. I've got 8 more miles to go. 9 times 8, that's 72. That's an hour and 12 minutes. You're doing all of this mental math.
That's right.
And you're so deeply inside your head and your body at the same time, because you're also recording what's going on physically.
That's right.
That really, that repetitive practice and enforced over 2.5 hour training runs kind of became like an extended meditation and mindfulness practice for me. And as a result, what it started to do for me, Chris, I'm curious if you had the similar experience when you started training for marathons. What it started to do for me was it started to make me think more and challenge thoughts more. And you just said one of the things that Joe was unable to do was be curious. Instead, what he did was he was triggered. He had this
That's right.
immediate reflexive reaction based on, all of these belief systems he had about this is my wife, this is what she should be, this is what our relationship should be, this is who and who should not be a part of the eroticism of our relationship. And he wasn't curious. Well, why is she at this point in her life?
Right.
Why might she do this? What was she getting out of it? Instead of him going there, he went to the normative male gender belief system. And that's why you see him freak out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Richard, to your point, I mean, you're absolutely spot on about the running. And I had the same experience. And again, I should be clarifying. You and I had our own unique experiences, but they are similar, right? So I went into that, and I'm going to use a term that you use in your work. And I started running in part so it would be my masculine practice, because I wanted a masculine practice where I go off into the wilderness on my own and do something difficult and come back and prove to myself that I could survive. Right. So that masculine practice, and by the way, men or women can do a masculine practice where you go off on your own and prove to yourself that you are a strong and capable person who can do hard things. And in that moment, the viewers will see Joe doing something. It's not a run. It's not a physically hard thing, but gosh, it's an emotionally hard thing. And so, yeah, so once the Joe character can have a similar experience in his life, and if he and Angela stick together, or if he starts a relationship with somebody else and they stay through the lifespan of the relationship, he'll have lots of opportunities to practice. He'll get surprised by something, because we all will, by our partners. No matter how well we think we know them, there's a whole universe of surprises waiting for us in them in long-term relationship. And when that next surprise comes, if he has done his training and he's differentiated, he'll be able to have his feelings, hold them, and be curious. But he wasn't in shape for that long run in the movie. I'll tell you that.
He was not.
No.
One of the podcasts that I've listened to where they broke down the movie, I don't know the 3 people who are on the podcast. I'll go and check them out a little bit more to understand them better. But one of them said that they thought a core theme of the movie was how does a couple in a long-term relationship keep things fresh enough that they can have a healthy, vibrant, long-term relationship. And the immediate thing that came to my mind when I heard this podcaster say that was continuously being curious about your partner, letting them unfold in front of you exactly the way they are versus the way the relationship has maybe suppressed or repressed a part of them that they're not getting to fulfill. Being courageous enough to say, my partner is going to evolve over this relationship, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of men, that's very difficult to do.
For sure. For sure. I completely agree with you. I think you're spot on. And Esther, again, who was a consultant on the film, she wrote a book called The State of Affairs. And one of her conclusions about infidelity is that infidelity often occurs because we have lost a part of ourselves in the relationship we're in, and we find it outside. Right? So your point about losing a part of yourself and then finding it somewhere else is critical for long-term relationship success. And success now, if we're in the business of relationship, isn't just longevity. It's longevity plus satisfaction in the relationship. I know plenty of people who have been together a really long time, and they have done so many behaviors and they've lost so many parts of themselves in the context of the relationship that really it's what they have left is hostile dependency. Well, that's not relationship satisfaction, and certainly in my book, right? So I think you're exactly right. And the idea that I can hold on to myself while the other person and me are evolving, and that I can hold that. And as they evolve away from my interests, then that doesn't feel like a threat. Or if it does feel like a threat, then I can hold that insecurity and then be curious. But it really does force an existential issue for the relationship. Can I hold the possibility that this won't last forever? Can I hold that possibility? And Edward Norton's character gives us some amazing examples of that in the invite as well.
And can a human being, male or female, in a heterosexual relationship be so mindful as to say, my love for a person should not be beholden on them being a certain way? That I'm seeing the broadest elements of this human being in front of me, and some elements wax and wane. Some are more prominent during certain times in life, and some, dissipate. As a almost 62-year-old male, I have defined myself so much as a father, as Scott Galloway says, a provider and a protector. That has been the predominant definition of how I've seen myself as a man and father over 30 plus years, maybe even longer, because we had infertility at the beginning and I was dreaming of that role.
Yeah.
But now at this age, my little birds need to fly on their own.
Yeah.
And I am now finally having a chance to define myself with those elements being less important to me being fulfilled, that I can now explore other parts of Richard that allow me to feel like a man, or whatever a man feels like, and to just be more whole instead of role. Did you see in Seth Rogen's character that he was managing any of that, especially since we know early on in the movie what had seemed to have been a zest for life in a certain vocation?
Sure.
And now, witnessing him in the movie, we don't see that anymore.
Right. No, Richard, you're exactly right. I thank you for sharing your story, because I think for your audience, and I'm not even sure you did this, you made a choice and you said, look, I have seen myself as a father even before I was a father. And that is really important for your audience to know, that we can see ourselves a certain way, even if life doesn't play out that way. You talked about infertility problems, and yet my identity, how I see myself, is that of a provider and a father. Right. And so that view of yourself exists before you had kids. Right. And so then you got to live out that dream for you. And then you did a good job as a parent. I always tell the folks I work with, parenting's the hardest job, because if you do it right, they leave. And so what you did, Richard, what you provided for your audience is a choice point. At that point, when your kids successfully launched, you could diminish and go off into the West, as they say, or you could turn east and you could look for a new horizon for yourself. And you did, and you did. But that was a choice, and not everybody makes it. And I think Joe gives an example of a man who unconsciously made the other choice. He said, "Oh, I've always seen myself this way. It didn't work for me. And so I am going to recede." And then there are scenes in the movie where he is being challenged to make, Richard, the choice you made, which is find a new horizon, find a new passion. And he actually pretty forcefully says, I don't have to do that. I get the right to recede and diminish. Now, the interesting part to me is he does get to make that choice. We all get to make that choice if that's what we want, right? But what effect does that have on the people around us? What effect does that have on my marriage? And that really plays out in this one day of filming. And so for your audience who hasn't seen the movie, this all happens, again, as if it's a play, all happening over the course of a few hours. So all of this unfolds in one dinner party. It's really astounding, everything they captured in that little bit. But Richard, you really did hit on something there. Joe made a very different choice than you made. He was deciding to recede and not to expand, and you have made the other choice. If I have a preference as a therapist and as me myself, I always want to choose expansion. But I have to remind myself that that's an individual choice, and we have free will, and people can recede, but then there are consequences to those choices.
Big time consequences. And like, like great podcasts and great movies, they kind of move to both the climax and the denouement that helps people step aside and say, what am I going to take away from this?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So as we near the end of this particular discussion, and I hope, Chris, you and I have a long and fruitful relationship as co-podcasters, because I love listening to you. And I'm really learning a lot, hearing you talk about things that I've never been able to abstractly put together in the way Richard needs to learn things. But again, without spoiling the ending, do you feel from the final scene that Joe is challenging masculine gender norms that perhaps he hadn't up till that night? And if you do believe there's some kind of epiphany going on based on what we see on the screen, what do you think that says for the average man?
It's a great question. I think yes, is the short answer to your question. I think there are certain scenes that we haven't really talked about or alluded to, I should say, because we're really trying to stay spoiler free. But there are a couple of explicit things that Joe does that really does say, oh, this is the norm in which he is operating. And those norms are fundamentally, I won't even say challenged. This night for Joe shattered those. So it really leaves us, and as the audience, you kind of get to pick. And I'll kind of give you a psychotherapy, pro tip here. How you see the movie says a lot about you. How you see the ending of the movie, I should say more specifically, says a lot about you. And it's a good mirror for those of us in the audience of going, what do I really believe? And I think, like Joe, it's the kind of movie that if we're at the right place to have that kind of shattering, then we have an opportunity. We can either retreat back into that safe, masculine, socially prescribed, norm, or we can build a new one, which, hey, look, it sounds optimistic and good. And I think on the surface, we all want to be that. But growth requires growing pain. And so what I see Joe having to decide, the real masculine norm, that he can either retreat into suffering, which I think is the masculine norm, or he can choose, Richard, like you did once your kids left, do I want to grow and suffer the growing pain that comes with it? And I think Joe is really at that critical juncture where he can either go back into his old familiar suffering, which, yes, it hurts, but it's familiar, so it's safe. And I think that's the masculine norm, that we're going to suffer in silence. Or I can suffer the growing pain of having to change my own belief system. But to do that, it's going to hurt and I'm going to have loss. And am I willing to take on growing pain? And I'm a biased assistant here as a psychotherapist. I always want my people to choose growth, but I have to hold in my heart that it is their choice and they have the choice to suffer.
I remember my first marathon was the P.F. Chang's marathon. It was in January, and there was a group of us that were flying out to Phoenix together. We were training together, and we were going to run it together. And my youngest son was about 3 years old, but he got an upper respiratory infection, needed to be hospitalized.
Okay.
So I stayed overnight with him because you had to have a parent stay overnight. And I was there Friday and Saturday, and he wasn't getting better. So I missed the Saturday group run with my friends. And I was in jeopardy of not making my final long run, the 20-miler, that Sunday because Tyler wasn't getting better.
Yeah.
And so, Sunday is progressing. It's getting, it's December. So you've got colder weather. It gets darker earlier. You're getting sort of that collapse of the window of opportunity to go get 20 miles done. And around 11 o'clock, the doctor came in and said, I think we're going to send him home today. Okay. So now I'm thinking to myself, how do I get this 20-miler in? I'm going to drop him off. We've got, we're going to continue his meds so that he can continue to get better. But I got to try to get this 20-miler in because in 2 weeks, I got to run 26.2. So I remember getting home with him and thinking to myself, what if I don't do the 20-miler? I did an 18 last Saturday. What if I don't do a 20-miler?
Yeah.
And what you just said to me, Chris, I think was what I went through mentally.
Yeah.
I said to myself, you're going to have to run it solo, and you haven't run a long run solo yet because you had all these wonderful friends that you were running with.
Yeah.
But did you get this far to reject the growth that you're doing? And maybe you'll grow even more and be better prepared for 26.2 because you did go out and do this 20 by yourself. I did. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was snowing as I was getting back at like mile 16. It started to snow. Luckily, one of my running friends, I parked at his driveway. So he was kind of coming out and checking on me and making sure I was okay. It was dark. I run in shorts most of the time. I was in shorts. The wind was picking up. It was brutal.
I mean, talk about a masculine practice, Richard. There it is, doing something on my own in the elements, in the wilderness, and then coming back. Wow. Kudos. I mean, to me, that feels like the actual marathon. I know 26.2 is coming for you, but that 20 sounds like the real deal.
It really was. And when I finished in Todd's driveway, he and his wife and his 2 kids came out into the street to clap me home. They saw me at the last 0.2 of a mile and they applauded me. And
it's amazing.
And I would have to say there was an epiphany of growth in that moment that when I got to Phoenix, I actually bonked in Phoenix because I had hyponatremia at about mile 20. I screwed up my liquid intake and I was taking in enough electrolytes. So I was a mess by the time I crossed the finish line. But anyway, I had so much confidence because of the growth I went through on that solo run.
Yes.
And I really do believe that was a moment mentally for me where I broke through something.
Absolutely.
About what a man is and is not, what Richard is and is not.
And what this man is and is not. Yes.
Myself inside a man box. It was like the box had been opened and I could be anything I wanted to be.
That's it.
I still needed a few years in my marriage to believe that emotionally and sexually. But at least intellectually, the door was finally open. Richard, why don't you confine it yourself?
Yes.
Go live the attributes you want to have to represent you.
So Richard, and I don't know the story, and I'm not asking you to tell your audience. I will say, though, in that story, that absolutely is the epiphany. And then epiphany is a moment, right? And then what you choose to do, as you just said, in the years afterward is the evolution. So Joe has now had the epiphany, but is he going to have the evolution? In your case, you had the epiphany, you chose the evolution, and it's entirely possible that the marriage you were in before won't match your evolution. And that is a really, really real possibility for those who pick growth. I may outgrow some of the relationships I am in. And that is part of the risk of evolution. And so as we as men make that choice, what my main goal in my practice is for men to choose consciously, not unconsciously. And I think Joe is a perfect example of a man who chose unconsciously in so many ways. But after this dinner party, he's having that epiphany moment. Now, does he choose evolution or not? You did, and I don't know what cost you paid for it. And I admire the hell out of you for choosing evolution. It is what I would choose and root for and be out there with your team clapping for you to do. And I would be for anyone in your audience who is choosing evolution after epiphany.
And one of the beautiful things that Rashida Jones, Will Cormack as screenwriters, and Olivia Wilde do with this movie is that they leave the ending so open.
Yes.
We don't know what the protagonists are going to do with their marriage, with themselves. We maybe are hopeful or not hopeful. You're bringing that yourself.
That's it. And that's what I would invite your audience in is your reaction gives you a snapshot, audience member, of where you are in this moment. I would ask you as the audience, do you like where you are? And if not, do you want to evolve to a different place, or do you want to stay where you are? Because it's up to you.
But ultimately, to me, that was the message that the invite presented to anybody who sits in a theater and watches it. What do you want to do? Because the choice is still yours.
It's still yours. And I will say, and I think this is just a beautiful illustration, Olivia Wilde herself in post interviews has changed what the ending means to her. So you kind of get the implication that she, as the director and one of the lead actors in the film, she was at one place when they wrap. And now after she sat with this, she herself may be at a different place. And so it is the kind of film that invites that kind of opportunity for all of us who saw it.
And if there's anything mindful masculinity wants to try to do, is just ask men to explore what they want to do next and not be so governed by reflexive gender norms that box them in to choices that maybe they don't want to make. Chris Brown, where can we find you online? How can people find you if they want you to? And I don't know if you're still taking clients, but
I
if they're
am
looking for you as a practitioner, tell us where we can find you and how they can get in touch with you.
Richard, thank you for the question. And thank you so much for this conversation. It has really been delightful for me. I am Christopher Freer Brown, spelled Frier, F-R-I-E-R. So Chris Brown, but not that Chris Brown. So I'm Christopher Freer Brown on most social platforms like Instagram, on Substack. My Substack is Love and Adulthood because I believe that relationships that start in adulthood need a new script. And so I am trying to help people write their own scripts for love and adulthood. So I'm Love and Adulthood on Substack. I'm Christopher Freer Brown on Instagram. And you can find my practice, which is called Sapient, Sapient. I'm at sapienttherapy.com.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time
You're
today.
welcome. It's my pleasure.
Been a wonderful conversation. And we even got to kind of critique a movie, which I've always had this Gene Siskel in me, and I got to finally do it today. And I am just blessed that you gave me that opportunity.
It's my pleasure, Richard. Please have a great day and good luck with your work. I'm a fan of yours and want to support you any way I can.
Thank you, sir. And I'm a fan of yours. And I definitely will be subscribing and paying a lot closer attention to you.
Thank you, sir. Have a good week.